Are the principles of liberalism viable in all societies? What are the various perspectives on the imposition of liberalism? In other words, what are the pros and cons of trying to spread liberal ideas around the world? Think about the countries in the world that are struggling. Wouldn't it be a good idea to have developed nations come in and organize their society based on the ideas of liberalism? This humanitarian focus would then give all people the rights and freedoms we take for granted. We could build their economy by establishing the institutions we currently enjoy to protect our private businesses, while also ensuring a degree of equality through the social programs we could show them. And if we're trading with each other, wouldn't that lessen the risks of war, as we don't go to war with important trading partners? So isn't it actually in our self-interest to impose liberalism? If all the world were more liberal, wouldn't that make the world a better place? Well, what are the consequences of imposing liberalism? Well, first, what's needed for liberalism to flourish in a society? Just telling a country what to do isn't the same as citizens accepting liberal values. As we look at the development of liberal societies from ancient Greece to the French Revolution to modern-day Arab Spring, we do see a pattern for what makes a liberal society successful. One, there needs to be an agreement that individual rights like rule of law, protection of private property, and fair elections must be protected by government institutions. This usually takes time, as it's a shift away from what you've always known. In Western society, it took us decades, you could say even centuries, to widely accept the ideas of the Enlightenment philosophers and have solid organizations to protect those ideas. Your society also needs to be educated, because they'll now be in charge of the political and economic decisions being made. And of course, to have an educated society, you need the money to pay for that education, so the society will usually have to have some degree of economic development. We find in many countries that if they implement some aspects of liberalism, like elections, without having an educated electorate, it ends up becoming an illiberal society. That's a society that claims to be liberal, but really isn't. There are two events that occurred early in the 21st century that demonstrate the difficulty of implementing liberalism in a society that may not be quite ready for it. I'm going to briefly summarize these events, as there's a ton of great documentaries out there that can do a better job of explaining these complex events. I'm talking about the 2001 invasion of Afghanistan and the 2003 invasion of Iraq. Let's start with Afghanistan. Prior to 2001, the world was wary of the Taliban government, but mostly just reprimanded the repressive regime. After it was discovered that the government may have played a role by supporting the al-Qaeda terrorists of 9/11, the world agreed that this government must be replaced. The United States got support from the UN to head up a NATO force that would invade Afghanistan and overthrow the government in the hopes of establishing a democratic society. This is just over a decade after the US had helped the Afghan people repel a Soviet takeover of government in the 1980s. This war on terror was a rare example of international peacemaking. The Taliban was easily overthrown, but the establishment of a liberal democracy has not been so easy. There are still Taliban and al-Qaeda insurgents who attack NATO forces. NATO forces have killed innocent people and referred to these terrible tragedies as collateral damage. The capture of insurgents led to the creation of Guantanamo Bay, which is a prison set up in a way that ignores the rights of prisoners protected by liberal laws, thus making the liberal nations look like hypocrites. And all of this has increased local opposition to the Western nations' war on terror. The government that has been established in Afghanistan is known to be one of the more corrupt governments in the world, with tribal conflicts preventing authentic representation of population. In rural areas, the extremists run the schools known as madrasas, teaching radical ideas, preventing true literacy that would help the country move away from a feudalistic society. And because so many people are illiterate, in order to ensure one person, one vote, people have their fingers dipped in ink to avoid multiple voting. So the extremists like al-Qaeda will threaten to cut the fingers off anyone who's voted because they don't want liberalism in their country. Now, it's not all bad. Many Afghans do want the liberal nations to stay and help them rebuild their nation state. NATO forces have been able to improve roads, build schools, and help the people see what the future can hold. And that's the key. Democracy can be really messy at first, so maybe we just need to be patient. That in the end, Afghanistan will be just fine. Our democracy wasn't always perfect. Or maybe imposing liberalism on a tribal society was a mistake. The Afghan support of al-Qaeda and the extreme actions of the Taliban government made the decision to invade and overthrow the government fairly easy for the world. There were few questions asked as NATO prepared to invade, but the acceptance of the invasion of Iraq was not so clear-cut. First, the United States needed to prove to the world that Iraq was in fact a threat. There was no way the Americans were going to let another 9/11 happen, and they felt they needed to do a preemptive strike to prevent Iraq from hurting them. Now, it's not like Iraq was an innocent little country that was minding their own business. In 1990, Iraq had invaded their neighbor Kuwait over an oil field dispute. The UN quickly responded with sanctions and then an act of peacemaking, where an international military force kicked the Iraqis out of Kuwait in a month. Part of the peace settlement of that conflict was that there was an international no-fly zone, and international observers would be allowed to monitor the elimination of weapons of mass destruction, which Saddam Hussein did have and was willing to use on his own people. But the UN inspectors would be harassed and kicked out of the country, and then there would be military attacks until Hussein would let the inspectors back in. And by 2002, the United States was tired of this game of cat and mouse. They had reports that al-Qaeda was flourishing in Iraq and that Saddam was rebuilding his weapons of mass destruction. The U.S., along with other nation-states like Great Britain, went to the UN to get support for another international invasion, but many countries questioned the evidence and the Security Council couldn't agree to a resolution for peacemaking. The U.S. created a coalition of the willing and went ahead with their invasion. Unfortunately, no weapons of mass destruction were found. Al-Qaeda wasn't actually in the country until the U.S. invaded, and the invasion led to a civil war, as the minority Sunnis, who had held power under Saddam, as they were part of his ethnic group, were suddenly having to accept the power of the majority Shia in this new democracy. For years, the horrific violence in the country from all different sides became a daily part of the news. Many people in Iraq began to say that they missed Saddam. Sure, he was a repressive, totalitarian dictator, but at least the electricity and water supply were running, and it was safe to go to the store. And like in Afghanistan, the treatment of prisoners and the use of torture led many people to reject liberalism. Democracy in the country is complicated, as various tribal groups all have candidates, with elections sometimes having more than 80 candidates to vote for, which is usually somebody from the same ethnic group, as patronage means that elected officials would use their political power to help members of their own tribe before other people in their constituency. And religious conflicts made the establishment of the new constitution very difficult, with many Sunni members refusing to sign it. There's so many other examples of the imposition of liberalism around the world, and these case studies are so dynamic, I want you to go out and research what's going on. Find out the latest conditions in Afghanistan and Iraq. Is the messiness of a new democracy starting to evolve into a truly liberal society? Take a look at the countries involved in the Arab Spring or the evolution of democracy in Pakistan. Investigate the current conditions in Haiti and Somalia. Are they still failed states? And would they benefit from an international organization coming in and telling them how to organize their society? What about historical examples? What happened when Canada tried to impose liberalism on our Aboriginal peoples? Is it a good idea to encourage economic globalization that would spread economic liberalism around the world? Or does that cause problems for the environment? There are good reasons for wanting everyone in the world to be treated fairly, to be protected by a government based on those modern liberal values of individual rights and a bit of collective responsibility that we're used to. But can we really impose those values on other people? If a dictatorship is repressing their people, is it our duty to stop them? Or does that just cause more problems?